Hello, everyone, and welcome back to TechChill. Thank you for joining us today. We have a great panelist of journalists who are going to talk about the media in the time of COVID. Joining me today, we have Benjamin Bathke from Berlin and Kit Gillet from Bucharest. Benjamin, can we start with you? Can you introduce yourself a little bit and tell folks generally what you do there in Berlin?
Absolutely. Thanks, Chris. So yeah, as you said, my name is Ben Bathke. I'm a Berlin-based entrepreneurial freelance journalist. I do most of my work for DW, Deutsche Welle, which is Germany's international broadcaster. I'm not officially, I'm affiliated with them, but I'm not officially representing them here today. And my beats are migration, technology in the widest sense, and the media business. So innovation, business models, disinformation, and among other things.
Great.
And yeah.
And Kit, what about you?
So I'm a British journalist, but I'm based in Romania and have been for a number of years. Before that, I was in Asia for a decade. I'm the Eastern Europe correspondent at Sifted, so I write about tech, but I'm also a freelancer. I work for the New York Times and The Economist and The Guardian, among others, covering Romania, Moldova, and events, really across Eastern Europe. So it's a very mixed bag of tech plus foreign news reporting, spot news, features, all types of things.
Yeah, that sounds a bit like me. I'm American journalist based in France since about 2014, and I've primarily write about tech for VentureBeat and a little bit now for Sifted as well, but also do, across the board travel spot news for the Los Angeles Times and other people. So, well, great to have you both with us. I think we have some interesting perspectives here. Kit, let me just stay with you for a minute. This has obviously been an extraordinary year, no matter what we do, what you do. I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit on the personal side, how that's affected you, particularly being in a place like Bucharest that people may not be that familiar with.
It's an interesting one because, obviously being based in Romania, I did travel a lot for work before this last year, and that has really been curtailed. So, I was on the road a lot. I was popping across the Balkans to, Greece to Ukraine to the Baltics. I would travel a lot, and that's massively changed. And so a big impact has been working out how to function without those trips. And there are, obviously the first thing to say is it has been possible. Zoom and these modern technologies has made it possible to do that kind of reporting, but working out kind of what has been lost in that process. I don't think people necessarily realize the nuances that come with meeting people face to face, with those kinds of interviews, and even just going out and having coffee with contacts, the kind of gems of ideas that come through that have been lost because of, because we are not able to meet face to face. I think that's been the big thing that myself and obviously most journalists have had to get used to.
Yeah, I mean, my experience when I'm being commissioned by someone who's going to pay for that kind of work, normally they tell me something to the effect of, we really want the reader to feel like they're there, on the ground with you, whether it's the smell of the croissant in France or whatever the local flavor is. And, it's got to be tough to do that in those circumstances when you're on a Zoom call. It's just not the same thing. Ben, and what about you? Were you also on the road a lot for your work, or were you primarily working from Berlin?
The latter, partly because the outbreak of the pandemic coincided with the birth of my son and his first year of life as the pandemic unfolded. So I wouldn't have worked that much in general, specifically field reporting anyway. But even if I wanted to, like Kit just described, I wouldn't have been able to as much. Although I did travel abroad twice. I went to Gran Canaria and on the Canary Islands, one of the Canary Islands off the Western Atlantic coast, the Spanish archipelago, to cover the migration situation there, because last year more than 23,000 people, migrants from Africa arrived to the to the island group. So that was one longer trip, reporting trip, which lasted 5 days. And the second one was a much shorter one to Tallinn, Estonia, to do a radio piece about Tallinn Music Week, which was kind of sandwiched in between lockdowns, and they just managed to put it on, and yeah, with in a limited fashion though, with fewer bands and fewer countries.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious about the Canary Islands then. I mean, that must have been, was it an ordeal to get there? Was it relatively straightforward as it would have been? Or I have to imagine you had to jump through a lot of hurdles to get there.
Yeah, in terms of hurdles, there weren't really that many. I mean, just the standard really. I mean, that was before we even talked about getting vaccinated really back in November. So just the standard, I guess, a PCR test. And then on site, just wearing masks and doing just adhering to the standard precaution. That was really it. But I do think that COVID had a more subtle impact on the reporting. That is that it really made access to information and facilities like hotels and camps where migrants live, and in general, just the accessibility and a lot worse. So I would say, I mean, you can't always say that's because of COVID, and I think that to a degree that was already the case before the pandemic. But I think that lots of authorities, but also NGOs, surprisingly, use it as a pretext sometimes to give you less information, and make the reporting on the ground very hard. So we ran into a lot of dead ends, had lots of interviews set up which were canceled last minute, and it was overall a bit frustrating. So that also, maybe we can talk about it later too, in terms of press freedom and the impact Corona had on that as well.
Yeah, well, let's come back to that. I just a couple more kind of personal questions here, and back to you for a second, Kit. So, you know, with both the isolation maybe that came with this style of work, but also the different groups that you work for. I know personally, I felt a pretty big impact, particularly on the freelance side, but you don't have to go into all the details, but were the organizations that you generally work with, were they affected financially, or in terms of what they could and couldn't do in terms of commissioning stuff?
So a little bit. I mean, I won't name names, but one of my main publications for about 3 months froze budgets. So that probably took away 20-25% of my pre-pandemic income was with that one publication, and that disappeared for about 3 months. But actually, apart from that, I think I was quite lucky. What did change was the types of stories, and I found it quite interesting, and I'm curious to know if you guys experienced this as well. Like the first 4 months of the pandemic, it sucked up all the oxygen. There was no interest in anything, or there was no budget for anything that was not somewhat linked to the pandemic. And then at some point last summer, maybe August, September, everyone got fed up of the pandemic, editor-wise, and they were just asking for anything that wasn't the pandemic. So there was this real shift where for the first kind of from March last year to maybe September, everything I was kind of talking to editors about or that they were interested in seemed to have some sort of pandemic angle. And then after that, yes, there were some stories I did that were pandemic related, but there was a kind of a desperation for anything that would take us away from this. And yeah, and that was, you know, very interesting to see, and also quite, I think it mirrored my own kind of feelings about what I was wanting to read and report about.
Yeah. And what about you, Benjamin?
Sorry, in terms of what exactly?
Well, just in terms of, you know, any of the groups that you were working with, was there a shift either in editorial interest or, you know, resources or commissioning, things like that?
Yeah, thanks for the reminder. So since I do about, I would say at least 80% of my work for Deutsche Welle and different departments within Deutsche Welle, I wasn't really, I didn't really feel the impact that much. I mean, I was in many ways, I'm an example of all the good the pandemic has brought about for certain people. I mean, I only had to endure minor pains, like a few canceled conferences I was scheduled to work at. But for me, by far, the advantages outweighed the disadvantages. I mean, I was able to work from home, and which was great because of the newborn. all the support that comes when you work for a legacy news organization, I'm sure, or I know that lots of freelancers don't have. Um, we were able to work from home basically within 2 weeks, which was a bit of a surprise because I didn't quite expect Deutsche Welle to be able to react to the changed requirements so quickly. So that was very nice. Basically overnight, we moved everything over to Teams, Microsoft Teams, and everything worked quite smoothly in terms of the conferences and making sure that everybody's on the same page. And I mean, I was able to report from the safety of my own home. I mean, journalism has to be, in my understanding, I think you would agree, in the field and talk to people directly and get the nuances of the story, as Kit said earlier. But for this year particularly, with the pandemic raging, I think I was very lucky in that sense. I was also able to tap into Corona relief funds, and yeah, I know that a lot of people didn't fared a lot worse than I did.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, on my end, one of my clients sort of rolled back salaries to avoid layoffs. You know, in the U.S., we saw a huge wave of either media layoffs or cutbacks, or in some cases, publications even closing down. You know, my collaboration with the LA Times, they completely eliminated their freelance budget about midway through the year. And they were even, I believe, doing like a furlough scheme of having people go to 4 days a week to avoid layoffs. So it was definitely uneven impact, but there was definitely, depending on where you were, a big shift. And I saw the same thing. It's funny because, you know, it was COVID. On the tech side, we were trying to figure out what that meant for us. And then, you know, in the fall, someone commissioned me to do a story about Armagnac, you know, just out of the blue, totally, you know, wanting something non-COVID related. And then, I think there's definitely a fatigue with that. At the same time, it's still such a huge story. It's hard to.
Yeah, and I should note that DW, Deutsche Welle, is funded by taxpayers' money. So we're not as vulnerable to a pandemic as maybe a subscription-based or advertisement-based publication in terms of the business model. So it's possible that our budget will get slashed next year when a new government will be elected in Germany, but it's pretty safe. I mean, it's mostly about reshuffling within the publication, because it's so huge. I mean, it's 30 languages, it's all different formats, and it's more than 2,000 people.
Yeah.
And regarding the LA Times, have they returned, or is it still frozen as far as you're aware?
It's still frozen as far as I know. The freelance budget is still locked down, and I believe they're still doing the furlough scheme. That could have changed in the last couple of weeks. I haven't heard, but you know, it was definitely, you know, that's a whole story of the U.S. media, how those papers make money. But you know, it's like car advertising and, you know, home sales and things like that just kind of stop, you know, really during a pandemic. So hopefully they'll turn that around. But you know, on the whole, I felt fortunate, you know, to get through the year in the way that I did. So I can't complain too much on that end compared to some of those other more extreme cutbacks I think that people faced and felt. Maybe one last personal question, and then I want to hit some bigger issues. But, you know, then just on a personal level again, you know, were there issues there's been a whole conversation in the last few weeks about, you know, the mental health of journalists, feelings of isolation, stress. Did any of that really shift for you guys in terms of, you know, your kind of mental well-being, or how you kind of coped with everything, or you know, especially I got to imagine having a newborn has got to had a whole other twist, Benjamin.
Yeah, thanks. That's true. I mean, I like to say we were living in the double extreme circumstances, extraordinary circumstances ×2, right? Because the pandemic, and then all of a sudden having another life to be responsible for and care for. So that kept us very busy, and yeah, otherwise, I mean, being able to live at home, I think having a partner is a big deal. Just somebody, just that human touch that, I mean, everybody I'm sure missed before long, because the pandemic continued much longer than I think most people would have expected in the beginning. And in terms of mental health, I mean, it's definitely a topic that's come up, and there's, I mean, within, I can't really go into much detail because it's I think it's confidential. It's just in terms of the internal memos, but there's been talk about just doing a bit less, and letting people, just giving them some breathing room, because of all the added workload that people and the things they had to do from home, take care of, and big, I mean, all these, just think about all these people having to homeschool, just the additional stress and that burden of basically working while schooling your kids and so forth. So I was lucky that I had quite a bit of support, but I can definitely use a vacation very soon. But I just don't know. Yeah, maybe later in the summer, we'll see.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. What about you, Kit?
Yeah, well, I have a 5-year-old, and so she was off for pretty much most of last year off school. And yeah, there was a period towards the end of last year when, you know, it was winter, when we didn't have word yet of the vaccines, you know, going into kind of production, and where I was just drained. And so there was a period of about 3 months last year where writing was a real slog, you know, just getting words on a page. And, you know, I was working late into the night to kind of compensate for needing to deal with childcare in the daytime. And yeah, I was properly worn out. And thankfully the schools are back now, and life, you know, the sun is out. And yeah, but there was a difficult period. And I imagine most people in every profession have gone through that this year, and in the last kind of 12 months, 15 months. But yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we got lucky in France. They managed to keep the schools open most of this year, with a couple short exceptions. So that was certainly helpful. And, you know, so we had that going for us. But at the same time, you know, it definitely at times felt isolated. You know, I mean, it's tough. You know, again, I don't think this is unique to us as journalists, but there's only so many Zoom calls, you know, you can do in a day, even as we sit here in a Zoom call. But you know, it gets exhausting not having that same interaction with people. So we just opened up here in France today, so fingers crossed that's going to shift in the coming weeks. And I've started, I don't know about you guys, I've started getting invitations to events or to travel or things like that. So, you know, fingers crossed for this summer. We'll see if that stuff really comes back or not. But I'm trying to be a bit more hopeful.
Yeah, I haven't had any travel plans yet, but you know, I've started in the last weeks to actually interview people face to face. Still in the last months, face to face. Still, you know, finding a way to stand on the street, you know, 1.5 meters apart, having a coffee, or you know, sitting in a park on 2 benches, you know, 1 meter apart, just because I miss that. And both personally and as a journalist, I think those are, you know, it's very important.
Well, let's turn a little bit to some of the bigger issues. And Benjamin, I want to come back to an issue you raised briefly earlier about press freedom and access and things like that. You know, certainly we've heard, I mean, I think in general, even before, unfortunately, the pandemic, we were hearing a lot of issues about press freedom, safety of journalists, you know, whether it was in the Far East, the US even, under the Trump administration. It's been, in my opinion, a rough few years globally for journalists, and the stories you hear continue to be sort of increasingly appalling. Then you have COVID thrown on top of that, which, as you mentioned, has been used as an excuse to take some of those further. I don't know if you've personally been impacted by that. It sounds like a little bit in the Canary Islands when you went, but what do you see happening just maybe with yourself or with other colleagues in terms of that shift against journalists?
Yeah, I mean, thanks. From my perspective, again, I'm when it comes to the Canary Islands, from my experience there, I can't really pinpoint it, right? To what degree the lack of access to information was caused by COVID. Although I'm confident that that COVID does play a role. And you've seen stories, you've heard stories about lack of access to camps, migrant camps in Bosnia and other places on the EU's external borders and so forth. And of course, there's legitimate fears around it, but then journalism needs, the free society needs a free press, and so that's certainly difficult. But in my case, I mean, in Germany, we've done fairly well. I mean, I just want to point out something, and you actually see it behind me too on my wall. This is a poster of the latest, well, that's the World Press Freedom Index from this year by the Reporters Without Borders. And so even Germany was stripped of its good classification, which is indicative of a larger trend. And to quote Reporters Without Borders, there's been since the outbreak of the pandemic, or last year in particular, there's been a dramatic deterioration in people's access to information and an increase in obstacles to news coverage. And I didn't really feel it that much, aside from my experience in the Canaries, maybe. Obviously, also for the reasons that I talked about. But certainly, people in other countries have felt it massively. And I mean, in Germany, to come back to that Germany for a second, that was because we're now down 2 spots. We're now at rank at 13th overall. It was because dozens of journalists were attacked by supporters of extremist and conspiracy theory believers during protests against pandemic restrictions. So these so-called how they call themselves, these lateral thinkers. But I think overall, I mean, it's been really, press freedom has been really threatened in many ways. And where it was molded into laws, I think they will take some time to recover from.
Yeah. And what about you, Kit? Have you felt or observed anything in that regard?
I mean, not specifically here. I've not noticed any curtailing of freedom or dealing with officials, but I have friends, you know, in Asia and other places that have noticed that effect. I mean, I also think, coming back to kind of the initial point of not being able to move around, I do think that's had an impact because, you know, a lot of journalists were coming into countries that are not places that do not have the bureaus. They're not Berlin and, you know, not Germany and not France, not London, you know, these kind of second, third tier news countries, if you will. And because those reporters are not able to travel in, not able to work with the local reporters, you know, a lot of that kind of the data is often missing from these stories because they're reporting from back home. And I do think that that is impacting not necessarily the ability to access from the sides of the officials or organizations, but the knowledge of how to access and just not being in country to get that access. And I think that's also having an impact.
Yeah, I mean, my first expedition and when I first moved to France was crazy, and not knowing anything about it and learning all that, even with total freedom of movement, was tough. You know, to have those kind of restrictions on movement and access to people, I can't even imagine how I would figure out how things work here. You know, I mean, I could eventually, but even all the information on the world being in some format on the internet doesn't quite replace that experience of being on the ground and being face to face and learning those systems. You know, the other thing.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it also leads to kind of an echo chamber approach, just because everyone's having to rely on the same, you know, sources that are out there if you're not on the ground, and that does impact the quality of what can be reported.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think something then that goes hand in hand with that, you know, you have challenges getting that information and access to it. And at the same time, I think we have all experienced and all seen that the world is awash in misinformation and disinformation and huge machines that have been created to propagate that. Again, Benjamin, I'll come back to you on this. Has that, you know, have you seen the impact or felt the impact of that, or you know, have you observed anything from your reporting or how that's affected the organization in Berlin?
Not Deutsche Welle itself, although I mean, I think misinformation has been on the rise around vaccines and their efficacy, for sure. And I mean, what I can really speak to. Because as I said, I cover migration, and the publication is called Info Migrants. It's a collaboration between Deutsche Welle and France Médias Monde, the French foreign broadcaster, and the Italian news agency ANSA. So we try to provide reliable information for migrants, which is, I make the point because there's a lot of rumors and half-truths and disinformation out there, especially in those kids, to your point, although you talked about reporting, but still within the migrant communities, through disseminated through WhatsApp and other platforms about vaccinations and other corona-related issues. So I just did a news piece the other day about migrants in Germany and that they, let me pull it up right here to get the number right. Only 20% of all asylum seekers who live in accommodation centers in Germany want to get vaccinated against the coronavirus. And that was according to a study done in one of the German states, but they said that all the other 15 states reported similar findings. So there's definitely a lack of trust in vaccines, and I'm sure, although it's hard to do, and I haven't surprisingly done many stories on this, because as I did a bit of research preparing for this talk, that about vaccine hesitancy caused by disinformation about it, or if it's just mainly rumors and half-truths. So that's definitely something. There's been numerous campaigns by authorities in Germany to educate people and to improve trust. But that's certainly something that's worrying, because I mean, lots of minorities are especially vulnerable to the virus, and if they're not reaching herd immunity, not nearly, then the virus will probably keep spreading, and there'll be new mutants, etc. So that's definitely something that I worry about.
And Kit, what about you?
I don't think I've got anything to add to that. Yeah, that was, yeah, I thought that was a very good point.
I mean, I'll just add a couple of thoughts here. I mean, on one hand, you know, my background was in US journalism, mostly for local newspapers. And, you know, one of the things that's highlighted for me was really the underinvestment or the lack of resources for skilled science journalists on local papers. You know, I may be dating myself here, but, you know, back in the 90s, I was working for a mid-sized paper in North Carolina. They had a science team, you know, 4 or 5 reporters on a mid-sized newspaper who were, you know, really specialized in how you read journal articles, the questions you have to ask scientists. And I have to be sure across the board that those people don't exist except for the very largest newspapers. And on the other hand, I did see a lot of, you know, newspapers engaging in more fact checking, you know, having fact checking teams, which has been a big trend for the last few years, which I think is great and needed. And at the same time, I worry it's not having enough impact. And the result of all this is then I worry about, you know, the trust that people have in journalists, because really that's at the end of the day, that's our big asset, I think, in terms of our relationship and the value we bring. And it's really tough to maintain that, I think, when, you know, everything you do is hitting up against a wall of misinformation on Facebook or Twitter or all these other platforms. But, you know, I'm hopeful that the battle will turn, but it's definitely a fight ongoing, I think.
But I think I'm curious to see, and I'm hopeful that, you know, the pandemic will lead to a rise in kind of budget for health reporting, for science reporting, for these kinds of topics, and that will bring the expertise. And yeah, I'm hoping that is one effect of this period.
Yeah, and in the process, also science communication, which is crucial, to just be able to explain why the measures that are taken are being taken, etc. Because that can create a lot of, or if you can do that properly, that creates less friction and just less skepticism, etc. So, and to your point, Chris, I've seen the rise of science journalism in Germany. That was definitely something that I've noticed too, and alongside them, the virologists they interviewed. So there's 2 journalists from Germany's public broadcaster ARD that received an important prize for their weekly podcast, the Corona Update, it's called, with Christian Drosten, probably the most well-known virologist in Germany. So that's important, and also science communication, like I just said.
Well, I think we're at the end of our time here. So I want to thank you both for taking this moment with us, sharing your thoughts. I wish you both the best in the coming months, and hopefully we'll all see each other someday soon in Latvia.